Hello, and welcome to Seafood Matters podcast, the voice of the UK seafood industry. I'm your host, Jim Cowie. In this episode, I am engaging with Professor Michele Stanley, a Doctor of Philosophy focused in plant pathology and mycology from Queen's University Belfast, with over 23 years research experience in the area of biochemistry and molecular biology. Michele currently serves the UK seafood industry as the Associate Director for Science, Enterprise and Innovation at the Scottish Association for Marine Science, commonly known as SAMS.
My name's Michele Stanley. I'm originally from Northern Ireland, and I worked, my PhD, my doctorate was on bananas, diseases of bananas. And unfortunately, when I did my PhD, the government decided that you didn't need plant pathologists, which led to an interesting segue then into the marine environment, because they decided that I'd probably be sympathetic to seaweeds. And since about sort of 1996, I've worked with seaweeds and microalgae and not looked back. So at the moment, I'm based and have been for the nearly 16 years at the Scottish Association for Marine Science outside Oban. And we probably have one of the largest seaweed groups in the UK.
Is the place in Oban, is that Dunstaffanage?
Yep, that's Dunstaffanage, yes.
I've been there and I've been involved years. My background's the fishing industry, and although I've got a restaurant now, it's a seafood restaurant, so I still class myself in the fishing industry, as opposed to the hospitality industry. When I was involved there, they were doing tests with farming halibut. Are they still doing that?
No, I mean it's so the history of SAMS itself. It as an organisation, it dates back to 1884, and it started off life in Edinburgh before it then moved across to Dunoon. So it was in Dunoon till about the late 1960s, and then it made the move up to where we are now. At Dunstaffanage, and it varies what we do. There was fishery science that's sort of come and gone. It's like a lot of things in science; things come and go. We do have Clive Fox who's here, and he does work in terms of fisheries, but it's not so much experimental stuff with fish. It's more what's happening out, would like to say in the real world, but yeah, what's happening in the real world.
Yeah, I remember one funny situation with the guys in Dunstaffanage. They were taking halibut, matured halibut, and they were changing them over in a car park near Fort William, and one of them fell and it was actually flapping over on the road in the car park, but it was absolutely it was not harmed in any way. It survived and went into the wilds and that, but it was really quite funny to think that a fish could be flapping on a car park and then still make the sea.
So it's we have some of the researchers involved with skate, and it's on the news a while ago about the egg that finally hatched. So we have been involved, it sort of in that kind of research, and that was with Nature Scotland.
Okay, yeah, and obviously your subject is seaweed, and I have to say that it's something that goes a long, long way with me. As a kid, I played in the rocks, and a lasting memory for me, and every time I'm in dulse, which is a seaweed I just think is an absolute fantastic seaweed. Every time I use it now, we use it in a restaurant, and but as a kid, my father used to take it home from the beaches, and in our front room, sitting room, he used to roast it in front of the fire. So you can imagine the smell in the sitting room, but no, it was what you did, and I still get that smell when I'm working with dulse.
Yeah, it's a really nice seaweed. So it's we we like to use Latin names because people have common names for seaweed, and they can vary depending where you're from. I mean,
Yeah.
dulles, that's the same. The Irish use the word dulles,
Okay.
and it was sold where I originally from, a place called Bangor, and the fishmonger used to sell little paper bags of it, and he'd go out and gather it from a place called Donegal. And I have, when I was so I did a while in the West Midlands in Birmingham before I came up here to Sam's. And I used to, when I visited home, I used to buy a couple of bags for one of the other researchers in the lab in Birmingham, because he really loved it. He used to microwave it.
So that is news now. That's wonderful. You actually sold it in bags.
So yeah, I used to, it was less than it was 50p to a pound for a little paper bag. So yeah, and I think sometimes we miss that bit of tradition. So I mean, dulles was used as well to dye Harris tweed at one stage. So I think we miss that bit of connection of our history with seaweed, and where it was used, and how it was used.
Yeah. And what's the main uses you have for it now, Michele?
So it varies. I mean, we're involved in a variety of different projects, and at the moment, one of the largest projects is a European funded project called Astral, and we're looking at cultivation of brown seaweeds, so the kelps, and that's linked into co-cultivation. So we actually have at the moment native oysters at the site, because brown seaweed cultivation. You have it there, you put it in early October, and then you harvest sort of late April, early May, and then the site's sitting there not doing anything. So we've got native oysters, and we were running a trial, or we have been running a trial between ourselves and our closest neighbour, who's an oyster farmer, and his system is the more traditional intertidal. We've been getting some really interesting results out, and the native oysters at the farm have done really well. And I say, just shows you can use the site for more than one thing. But I also grow sort of green seaweeds and reds. So I have done some work with dulles and cultivating it, because that's the problem. Or there's a slight issue. Some of the seaweeds get popular. The danger is you end up removing too much from an area, and something like dulles, it hasn't got what we would describe as a wide dispersal, geographical area wise, when it reproduces. So if you do get someone coming in and clearing an area, it could take it a while to come back into the area. So for us, cultivation's about trying to secure what's there, so trying to minimize potential environmental damage. And also it's interesting, from a science point of view, it's quite interesting to see how these seaweeds grow, and how the environment actually affects what they do. So I did have a student who worked on pepper dulles, which is another red seaweed, and it's the taste it's harvested for, and that was really interesting about following how the environment, how it grows, how that then affects its flavour, and to get that flavour, and then can you mimic that with the growing conditions artificially, and you can. And again, that just means if there's pressure on again that seaweed, then there's other alternative ways of growing it to try and remove the pressure on wild stocks.
Yeah, and do you feel that any of the issues with the environmental impact or on affects them, or it's interesting what you're saying about the dulse. I'll keep calling it dulse if you don't mind. But
That's fine.
it's funny how I can exactly hear what you're saying, and I'm with you, because I remember the small fishing village I'm from originally, Helmsdale. There was a rock, and it was known as the Dulce Rock. You didn't get dulse on every rock. But nobody at that time, I'm talking 50s and 60s, and my father was younger, and they used it a lot for different things. Nobody cleaned the rock.
Yeah, it's there's an education element, so people going out foraging, it's actually, there's a bit of an education about how you should actually harvest. So you can make sure that the seaweed can carry on growing. And I think, again, sometimes people, I'm not going to say it's a lack of respect, but I don't think people think about, they see it as a free resource, but then they don't see the wider picture. And that, if you don't respect it, then it's not going to be there always for you to go back to, or for others as well.
Michele, I don't think you need to feel that you're going to upset anybody. You're certainly not going to upset me. I totally resonate with you. It is a lack of respect. If they clean an area, it is a total lack. It's a lack of understanding and respect.
So I think there's an education element in this, and getting people to value what's in the marine environment.
Yeah. I mean, it's got its uses as well. When I was a kid, and before starting work and wanting pocket money, obviously what we all used to do is pick winkle, the whelks, like the wee black winkles on the beaches. And my father had me well trained, and we used to get the big tangle. We used to call them tangles, the kelp, and I would put them in pools and leave them, and the whelks would stick to them. So after a while, you would just pick up the tangle, stick it over your sack, and shake it. So it was a lot better than breaking your back bending.
Yeah, there's some really good people out there. I mean, there's a guy called Lewis and Harris, who actually does the harvesting for Harris Gin of sugar kelp. And he's really good, very passionate about what he's doing, making sure he's very good about how he harvests, and he does supply into restaurants as well. And I think that's it. It's just, I say, it's an education element with people. But again, as well, there's also, for some people, there's still a bit of a stigma about, at times, seaweed seen as a poor person's food. So from an Irish point of view, with the potato famine, there was particularly a brown species of seaweed that was eaten because that's all you could get, a thing called Palvicia. But I think that's the other thing. It's again, it's education and getting people to respect what's there.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a very good friend of mine, Sam Britton, his name is. He's in the Orkney Islands. He's made a wonderful, he calls it Orkney craft vinegar. And he starts with the yeast and makes a beer much of it. And two of his products, one is sugar kelp, and the other is smoked dulse. So he actually gets the dulse from the beach and smokes it, and they're absolutely outstanding products. You could actually, well, they are probiotics. You can actually take a swig as if it's a dram, and it's so good for you.
Yeah, I think he did do James Martin maybe a couple of months ago. So he was on James Martin, yes.
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah, that's was very interesting. It's there's quite a push in terms of food for seaweeds, but there's also people looking at a higher value, and that's in terms of other products. There's everything from some people are interested in bioplastics through to replacement leather as well. So there's a lot going on with seaweeds at the moment.
You talk about the potato famine. One of the jobs I least liked as a child was wheeling it up in a barrow from the beach and putting it on the drills of my father's tatties.
Right, lazy beds, yeah.
And it wasn't rotted or anything. It was just straight onto you plant the potatoes and the drills, the seaweed goes straight into it, and fantastic.
Yeah,
fertilizer.
Yeah, and there's some of the industry is actually, I mean, and that's where again if we go to Lewis, Hebridean seaweeds, and I visited their factory just before COVID shutdown, so the February, and it was interesting because what they were doing, they harvest mainly Ascophyllum, so rack, and they were converting the factory so they could get extract out of it, and that's a plant growth stimulant. So you're just expanding what they were actually doing with the seaweed. And again, for that sort of industry, they are very well regulated, and they're really good about how much material they're taking out, making sure again that it's regrowing, and they're minimizing any impact that they're having.
Yeah, that's good. One of the things that I always feel it's a lack of understanding, as you said earlier, with the public when they're on a beach, is they just see seaweed. When it tides out, they see it lying flat on a rock, and they think there's nothing to it. There's no life or anything, but I just think it's so interesting, the fact that when the tide comes in, there's different heights, and some of them have the air. What's that ones with the air pockets?
So the air bladder. So you get that with fucus. So different types of fucus, and you have that with Asco. So that's rack as well. It's got the little air bladders, and that means it then can float.
Yeah, and I just think it's amazing how for small fish and sea life in general, it's giving different cover and food and everything to a whole amount of different life.
Yeah, and if you have a look at the kelp beds as well, it's fish nurseries. Even has a role. You have a look. We had a student who did a study on Uist and the beaches at Uist, and you get a lot of seaweed. Storms come through. You get a lot of seaweed washed up in the beaches there, and even the role it plays environmentally, like ecologically, supporting even during the winter, because you get sort of 2 meter high kelp washed up on the beach, and that it's warm inside because it's starting to rot, and because it's warm, it means you get insects in it, and then you get seabirds coming in, migrating seabirds coming in and eating the insects. So it's even a role it has, even when it's on a beach starting to rot, it has a role.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I never thought of that, but that's exactly right. And it's so part. I mean, one of the other things I feel is so strongly about is seagulls, seabirds, and when I almost I cringe when I hear people trying to do like arrange culls and that because they reckon that they're making a noise and they're dirty and they're going inland at times, further inland. But it's food that I mean, it's like ourselves as humans. They're feeding young and looking after their families, and I think it's just outrageous. In fact, I go maybe some people would say too far. You they want to get a cull of seagulls if the people have rubbish outside and they've maybe burst the bag and with their beaks and that and they've made a mess and rather than put their be responsible and put it in a bin but they're what I feel, a rat, they don't hear and they don't see, so there's nothing done about that.
It's yeah, again. There's an educational. Seabirds will go inland if there's a storm at sea. It's not an unheard occurrence. And you're right about rubbish. If the rubbish isn't put away properly, and they're after food, and it's easy food, then the seabirds are going to do it. Seagulls are going to do it. So it's easy food, rather than hunting for it. Yeah, if somebody's going to leave something that they can eat, they're going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't imagine that a situation being on a beach, a harbour, a fishing village, and you don't hear the sound of seagulls. It would be. I wouldn't feel I was at the shore.
No, you wouldn't. And the two go hand in hand.
Absolutely, yeah. So is it in Oban you're based?
So yes, we're just outside Oban. We're about 2-3
Yeah,
miles outside
yeah,
Oban.
yeah,
So yeah, it's a nice spot. We're right beside Dunstafnage Castle,
yeah,
so it's quite good, and it's good for seaweed as well. We have what we describe as the back beach, and there's a couple of other beaches around us, and they're very good for seaweeds. So literally, you walk sort of a few hundred yards, and you're on a beach.
So, if you don't mind me asking, Michelle, you arrive on the beach. What do you do?
Oh, I go in for a paddle and have a look at the seaweed usually. Um,
Good on you. Good answer.
yeah. So yeah, it's usually in for it's in for a paddle. Have a look at the seaweed. I say it's interesting, and even how beaches change. The same beach changes every year. So yeah, no, have a look and see what's growing.
And what would you do with, do you just keep monitor it or do you pick some and,
So there's some I eat. Um, so there's some I eat. Others, is stuff material we're working on. We're interested in how it's growing, how the environment affects each year, how it grows, and then trying to predict in a smarter fashion when to harvest. So if we're cultivating kelps, there's a bit of a tipping point about when you harvest it and when it's in good condition. And it's being smart about that. Can we monitor with a sensor buoy? And that means then we're not having to take boats out every time, all the time. So can we start to reduce our carbon footprint with what we're doing?
yeah. And what all are you, is it for the end game with the seaweed?
Oh, depends on the species we're growing. A lot of it is, the interest is in food. But again, some of the interest is in the products. So we've just finished a project with University of Wolverhampton in the Midlands, and that's seeing if you could take the seaweed and byproducts of the seaweed. You're extracting something that's maybe a bit more valuable, and then using that as a basis for fermentation for a bacteria that produces a polymer that you can actually use for encapsulation of different compounds that you can actually eat.
Yeah.
So it's just making the most of the seaweed. We, from a food point of view, a project we had finished last year, we were looking at the bacteria that potentially are on the seaweed, and human health, and how you monitor for that. And that was with colleagues in Greece. So a lot of it ranges everything from population genetics, so how diverse a population is in a particular area. And that's important if you're cultivating, because the last thing you want to do is have an impact on the wild populations that are there. So ensuring that you're using material that's from the same area. And actually the licenses have just changed, and you have to say in Scotland where your seeded line, where your seaweeds come from, which is good, through to what's actually in it and what potentially you can use it for. And we have done energy projects, and that's the last thing that you maybe want to do with the seaweed. That's like when you've got everything else that's interesting out of it. A thing called anaerobic digestion, so producing methane gas that you can then, I'm going to say burn, but you can actually use that to drive combined heat and power plants. So can you do that? Are you going to have to use it? Can you use the seaweed alongside other materials, biomass that's going into that sort of system? At the moment, I've got a project we have a small company, a micro SME that's on our site called Crewbag, and that does work textiles. And we're looking again at using dulles for dyeing wool. So it can be quite a variety of different things happen.
Yeah. One of the things you'll be able to know more about it than me, but one of the things I was fascinated with, and it was only later in life that I almost stumbled across it. I was, the seaweed that the Japanese made famous, nori.
Oh yes, nori, yeah.
And you obviously use it in sushi and stuff like that. Well, I have there's certain rocks that I've got it. We find it up our way. But one of the things that absolutely staggered me, and I didn't really think of it before, it's very seasonal.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, because that's lava bread as well in Wales. And it is very seasonal. And actually, in Wales, they used to have drying huts along the coastline that they used to harvest it and would air dry it. There's only one hut left, but it's the same seaweed. And yeah, it is. So seaweeds do have a seasonality to them.
I didn't realize that until I went to, and I would go for this nori, and I wouldn't get it. And then this time, then maybe later on, I would get it. And I kind of worked it out. Gee, this is seasonal.
Mm-hmm. So it's not so much with kelps. Big brown seaweeds, they can live up to 7 years. But some of the others, yeah, there's the seasonality to it. The sea lettuce as well. That's got a seasonality to it. Okay. So yeah, and it's again, some of them don't like summer conditions, so they'll die back in the summer. Some are happier and higher light levels, and they'll you'll get more of them over the summer. Again, some of them don't like the lower light conditions over the winter, so they die back over the winter. Some others are happier over the winter.
Yeah. And what they're obviously, I mean, in modern terminologies, a lot of the seaweeds would come into the bracket that we call now superfoods.
Yeah, I don't like the term superfoods, I have to confess.
But it is a superfood.
Well, again, there's variety, and it depends on the seaweed. And it depends on what you're after and what's in it.
I'm thinking of the mineral, the natural minerals.
So the natural, yeah. So, something like dulles, if it's treated in the right way, that's got a high vitamin E content. And it's the trace minerals. Some of it people will say it's the protein, so a good source of protein. But again, that depends on actually how you're getting at the stuff that's in the seaweed, when you eat it, and how it's broken down. Because you're still, I'm not going to call it a plant. People who work with seaweeds get very annoyed because technically most seaweeds aren't plants. They're photosynthetic organisms, so they use light to grow. But they still have cellulose in their walls. So it's how you break that down to be able to get at the goodies, and how it's treated and how it's being prepared. So something like nori, I mean that's we went to a conference in South Korea a few years ago, and we did the tour and went to Wondo, which is the main seaweed growing area in South Korea, and it was brilliant. So we went to a nori factory, and it's even how that how the material's treated. It's heated, chopped, and then it's formed into those squares that you recognize as nori. So it goes from being red to green. It's very much how it's been treated, how you can then actually get at what's in the material, because we don't produce the enzymes that necessarily break down the cell wall, so you can get at what's inside.
And another modernism, which I actually think it's quite good to a degree as well, although I don't like a lot of the new sort of ways with things like seaweed. But I think some of the chefs really, and they've given it names. Like, I mean, the green seaweed, we got a lot in the rocks. I mean, they call it sea lettuce now, and I think that's a great idea.
But that's actually, it's always been known as sea lettuce. That's it. Yeah. So it's a species called Alva lactuca. It's a great one because I don't know whether you remember back to the Beijing Olympics.
Oh yeah.
And there were where they were holding the yachting events, and there was these pictures of all this green seaweed, and that was sea lettuce that had to be cleared out of the way before they could actually hold the event. It's an interesting seaweed, and it's quite a good. It grows. If it's got enough nutrients, it will cause blooms. Is the best way of describing it. But it's one of the it's an interesting one.
It's fascinating just listening to you, Michele, and it's almost like plant life. Do you reckon that all the different seaweeds have all different minerals and nutrition?
So they all have at a very basic level. They all have protein, sugars, lipids, and then they have their pigments. And that's at a very basic level. But those levels of those compounds vary depending on the species, can vary depending on the time of year you're harvesting. And then they have other trace minerals, trace compounds in there that can affect the flavour. And again, there's time of year when you harvest, best times, not so good times. There's things like iodine content. So if you get too high in iodine content, then the seaweed can taste bitter. So there's a great deal of variety. I mean, I don't think people realise that the environment has an impact on how the seaweed grows and whether it can get everything that it needs to grow. And then that varies depending on the time of year, and that's like anything on land as well. There's a seasonality to it.
That's what I think is maybe not so widely known about seaweed, because it's taken for granted, really, I suppose. It's just lying on the beach.
Yeah, it is, and it's again, it is quite fascinating, because people think, it's just there, lying on the beach, not really doing anything. But it has a role to play. It's very important to the ecosystem, and it is very much an education.
Yeah, the area I go up here for dulse, it's a small bay, and it's just a certain where it is. You need a good low tide to reach it, and what we call the stream tides, is with the full moon and when there's a good stream tide, and that's when I go to that area and get the dulse. Now, I went one time. It was in one of the first quarter or second quarter of the moon phase, and it was dull tides, so it wasn't ebbing the same. And I went along just to see if I would maybe just get close to a bit. And the area where I get it was full of water. The bay, it was full of water, and I counted the heads of 9 seals. And I thought to myself, well, it's your turn now. I'll get my turn in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, I do love a low tide. Yeah, spring tide. Spring tides are fantastic, because you can just get so things like some of the red seaweeds don't like too much light. So that's why they're further down the beach, and that's why usually for some of them you can't get at them unless you have a really low tide or spring tide, and that's when you can it's easier to get at them. So they all have their own place on a beach as well, depending what sort of conditions they like.
Yeah. And where do you see your research going?
Oh, that's a big question. It's an interesting one, because I'm happy growing seaweeds, trying different types of seaweeds, and just seeing what happens. So at the moment I've got a student who's just finishing off a master's, and we're looking at a particular red species. It's not native to Scotland, and we wouldn't grow it outside. It's something we've been growing in the lab, and it's the one that everybody's been getting very excited about for, if you feed it to cattle, it reduces methane production. Wow. And that project was I'm not going to say it was a bit of a laugh, but it was just to see whether we could do it.
Mm-hmm.
And we put it in a thing called a photobioreactor, which you're not supposed to be able to grow seaweeds in. And we've had it grow in a photobioreactor. And again, that was just to push the research a bit and see what we can do and what we can't do. So yeah, it's a challenge of being able to grow things, but actually just understanding them more and understanding how they grow naturally and how the environment supports their growth, how things are changing as well, and whether that's going to have an impact on the seaweeds and what sort of seaweeds we get, and again on their growth.
Do you notice a change?
So it's interesting. I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues yesterday, Mike Burrows, who does a lot of survey work with seaweeds, and we were just looking at again the back beach and some of the rocks, and it's interesting. You've got a line where the fucus has gone, and we were just trying to figure out what's happened to the fucus that year, for you just to get that gap in the rocks. So it's an interesting one because you've got to unpick what happens each year and how that can be different. What we're not maybe seeing as many changes up here, but I do know, say, the south coast of England, you're starting to get changes in the big browns, the kelps, because it's starting to warm up there, and they don't like warm water. So you're getting a change in patterns and distributions. So you don't necessarily get it same up here, but what we have noticed is, this last year, the storms have been coming in a different direction, and that's maybe had an impact. But that's not to say next year, they're going to be again in that new direction. And so it's a difficult one unless you're taking long-term data sets. You can miss what's actually happening.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But going back to what you mentioned about how the lifespan and the kelp, you say 7 years. I've seen it's my father used to a very philosophical, down to earth way of describing things, and we used to find that with going back to what I said, picking winkles. The more rotten and smelling the seaweed, the more winkles you got there.
It's again easier to digest, get at. So it's a lot of seaweeds, when they get washed up on the beach. Other than some of the kelps, the ones with the big spikes, that the stipe can last a while. Actually, dogs like even the stipes. They can last a while, but actually the other material we call phallus tissue, that can start degrading really rapidly. So for some of the kelps, that can start degrading within sort of 24 hours. Others, it takes a bit longer, but once it starts rotting, it starts being a bit easier to digest. So one project we were involved in, it was taking kelp biomass after it being fermented for ethanol production. And it was actually taking that fermented kelp and using it as a pig feed. And it worked really well, so just taking what was left over. And that's the other thing, it's a bit like, what you were talking about, pickling almost, or fermenting, like cabbage. So, there is the possibility with a bit of fermentation, it makes it, a bit easier to digest and a bit more interesting. Not suggesting you should try pickling kelp, because when it starts to go, it does smell quite badly. But so there's interest in, again, can you extract something that's maybe a bit more, well, not more valuable, but can you get the most out of the biomass and, get something else out, and then, say, can it go to something like animal feed because it's in a better form to be eaten?
It's funny you should say the way you're just making me think of so many different things. And when you talk about the smell of the rotting seaweed, I just love that smell. and it's funny. My wife is from farming people. Her dad was in the sort of farming people in Ayrshire, and she loves it. She loves the smell of cow's manure. So
it's that smell. I mean, it's even the smell. It's just very, for childhood memories, it just brings that back. I think for a lot of people who've spent, did spend a lot of their childhood on beaches, it's just that sea smell just brings it all back.
Yeah, but latching on to one thing, another thing that you say there, which I find really interesting. A real bone of contention with our fishermen. Our fishermen, as I say, the UK, is there's fishing, there's industrial fishing for sand eels. For the Danes mainly, they're industrial fishing for sand eels up our east coast, which is the food. I mean, sand eels is recognised as one of the most important food for our seafood, our fish, and yet they are fishing our fish's food for pig farms in Denmark. And I'm hearing you what you're saying there. Is it no? Does it not make so much more sense if we do something with seaweed?
It comes down to economics and how much so at the moment, if you're looking at say seaweed farming, that you'd need to make a dent on an industry like pig feed. It's expensive currently to do the cultivation. So although cultivation of the kelp's well established in China and the Far East, there they've maybe not mechanized as much because again there's a difference in labour costs. And what we're doing now, and what people are thinking of is how do you mechanize it, how you make it cheaper to do it, and moving that cost. But there's also again I think people miss the whole thing. There's a conversation, and it's interesting. There's a farm now, Southwest Mull and Iona Community Development, and they have a seaweed farm, and this is their first year. And it's interesting there because it's community. They had a conversation with the local fishermen, and they actually asked them not to put the farm in the first place, and that was fine because it's this conversation, and they had a conversation. They listened to each other, and I think that's the whole problem sometimes of there's not that communication right at the beginning before someone decides it's a good idea, and they moved their farm, and it's worked. And it means everybody's being good neighbours to each other, as in they're having that conversation. But it's getting things to a stage where you've got a viable alternative, say for fishermen, and again, there's having that conversation early on, rather than going along to people and going, really good idea, do it, rather than having a conversation with them and thinking of, what do you think?
Mm-hmm.
What's the pros, what's the cons? How do you think we could do this together? And I think that's something we do need in the marine environment, having those joint conversations.
That's so important. I think that's a fantastic idea. And is this just in its first year?
Oh, for work we're doing. I mean, we've been seaweed growing.
No, sorry, I meant the farming.
Oh, the farming. So the Mull farm, that's their first year. You've got a community trust up in Barra as well. I'm not sure whether they put in material this year. So you've got along the west coast, you've got farms starting. There's another one on Skye, and that's kelp crofting. There's one on Arkamarkin, the peninsula there. You've got New Wave Foods off the little island called Kerrer here in Oban. So you're starting to get more and more people interested in actually growing seaweed and setting up farms.
What's happening in Kerrer?
So they're at the end of, I say Kerrer, it's south of Kerrer. So they've been growing for the last few years. So they're interested in putting the seaweed into food. So I think they've actually put it into crisps.
Okay.
So they're interested in food applications.
There's a company up here started Shore, their name is.
So they're the same company.
Oh, yeah,
so they do,
yeah.
So they do wild harvest as well as growing. But again, it's cost. So it's trying to get the cost down to make it economically viable.
Yeah. They dry it, and one of the things you might be able to help me here. I've dried dulse to the point, and then tried to blitz it to get it to powder. I've never ever been able to get it dry enough to make a powder. It stays like a flake.
So the thing is, are you air drying, or are you using something like a dehumidifier?
A dehumidifier.
So you've used a dehumidifier. It's probably not been dried enough. So I have to confess, when we're working with seaweed to be able to do the analysis on it, we use a technique called freeze drying, and that removes all the moisture.
All right.
Literally removes all the moisture, and then we can actually powder it. It comes down to, there's probably still some residual moisture in it, and that's why it doesn't want to sort of blend. I mean, we've used everything from a coffee grinder, to a blender to get it to go powdery.
I know all about that.
So it's probably still got some residual moisture in it, and that's why it doesn't want to go to a powder.
It certainly defies everything I've tried anyway. But I love eating it, even whether it's dry form or on the beach. I just love the taste. I love the taste. And it's really interesting from what you're saying, Michele, because there's obviously quite a bit going on with seaweed.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's the very popular thing to be doing at the moment, and there's lots of people looking at setting up farms, and also there's interest in growing. Dulles at the moment. People can't keep up with the demand, so there's interest in how you can potentially grow it at sea, the same way we do with kelp. Or companies are looking at what we describe as tank cultivation, so being able to grow it on land. There is a company in the US called Oregon Dulles, but they're not growing Dulles. It's a different species, but they just called it Dulles. And they're putting it into everything, the protein shakes and everything. But again, so they're growing it on land in tanks. And that's just to get enough biomass to start meeting the demands they have.
Yeah, it'd be interesting when that starts. If it's something anything like with plant life, because take for example, you get a raspberry in your garden. Okay, it's nice, but never is it compared to when you get them wild in a bush.
It's that thing. It's whether you're it's the variety, whether you're replicating what's growing in the wild, and that's that. There's questions coming up for seaweed in terms of again, China, because it's a very well established industry. They already do what we describe as selective breeding. So the same way we do with plants that you would buy in the garden centre. It's a variety. It's been bred. So there's questions now, within the UK, in Europe, selective breeding. Is that how you want to go with seaweeds? Do you actually want to have a monoculture the same way you would have with agriculture? And we're slightly different. I think people miss, so within a Scottish context, I have to show what I'm growing is from the local area originally. And that helps with wild stocks and helps not having an impact. But again, it's not really a monoculture because, we have all our lines and moorings in, and we don't clear that off. And you get seaweeds and other things come in naturally, and they grow on the structures. So it's not something we clear off. We leave it there. And there's that whole question as well. When you start putting structures in the mortar, what else is growing on there, and does that help the biodiversity in an area, and help the other organisms that's there.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds as if Mother Nature still has a hand in it as well.
Yeah, and I think there should be a respect for that. I think for some people who think seaweed, there's a whole thing called blue carbon, and that's all to do with seaweed, whether it captures carbon and how much, and people are using that at the moment as leverage for growing seaweed, and it's an interesting one because they don't understand that the full life cycle of a kelp or a seaweed, where you grow, the site selection. So it's like anything, it's choosing the appropriate area. If you're going to grow, cultivate. It's growing in an area that's going to support, the species you want to grow. And that mightn't be, could be that it may not be the same species I'm growing where we are, because it's not suited to that area. And again, how it grows, seasonality to it. And what you want to actually want the biomass for right at the end, why you're doing it and what do you want to use it for? Because again, that's going to be down to what the environmental conditions are, how long you grow it for, again, you're getting year-on-year variation because you're out in the sea and things vary every year.
Would the seabed structure have a hand to play in it with those type of rocks and things like that?
So no, for how you're growing, you're not relying on the seafloor. Again, there is a question of again where you choose to grow, because you could be causing shading. There's a kelp bed underneath you. I mean, for what we do, we know that under our farm there isn't any other seaweeds. We've got a kelp bed beside us because that's nice and rocky and it grows there. But actually under the farm, because it's quite sandy, we don't have any kelp that grows underneath the farm, so we're not having that impact on the shading. So again, it's all about site selection, but there's a whole thing on scale as well, how large you're growing, how big a scale you're growing on. And again, respecting the environment, because there's what we would describe as carrying capacity. So that's how much nutrients is in there, how much of that nutrients actually supporting maybe local populations. And then that potentially dictates how much seaweed you can grow. So you're not damaging or not competing. The local populations aren't competing for how much biomass you want to grow.
That's interesting because I'm thinking when I'm, on the beach and when, it's, you lift a bit of seaweed and there's crabs, small crabs. You've disturbed them, so they're looking for cover, and lots and lots of wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
So important.
Yeah, I mean, we get in lump suckers, so we will get those in, and we always make sure that we put them back in the water, and again, because you're not clearing off the structures as well, that helps give them a home when we remove our seaweed. So as it's an interesting, I don't think people start to think about, it's almost like a field where, a hedgerow in a field, and you don't want to clear that hedgerow off because that's where the birds and everything go. It's a similar thing, it's having those mooring structures in, and having other things grow on it. And it's like the seaweed farm hedgerow.
It's a great description, because that's exactly what it is.
And yeah,
and the farms are the hedges are so important. I don't think there's enough of them nowadays.
No, we got away from that, and again, it's a difficult one because when you're looking at food, scales needed and what we're growing, and how we grow. It's always that difficult conversation. Again, it gets back to economics and how much it costs to do it. And if you're a large farm, potentially, having that hedge in the way it costs you money, because you have to go round it and you can't just do a straight line.
Yeah. But I mean, I go back to my father, because I just learned so much from him, and we used to be in the beach a lot, and he's explained how even like Olympics, you would always see the adults. It was like, people don't associate them with families, but it was like that. And he says, if you're breaking them off to use them, eat them, there's certain ones you take and ones you leave.
Yeah, and that again is it's realizing it's an education thing. It's being more in sync with the environment and what's going on, and where you should be taking, potentially if you're going to take material, where you're taking it from, being responsible in how you're doing it, and actually trying to minimize any impact that you're going to have.
Yeah. Do the like of when you mentioned oyster farm and that, would they use seaweed?
So not really, no, because the oysters eat microalgae, and there are advantages in co-cultivating them together. And the oysters we were growing were native oysters. So native oysters are very slow growing, not like the Pacifics. And again, that's interesting for us, because if we can leave them at the site just to grow, and it's just cleaning off the baskets that they're in, it's the minimum amount that you have to do to support them. So no, but John Hamilton, so it's Locknell Oysters, is our closest neighbour. He is interested in setting up his own seaweed farm with oysters and doing that co-location. But there's some evidence that at a local level, if we're looking at, because of CO2 increases, the oceans potentially are getting more acidic. And for something like a shellfish, that's bad, because the shell actually gets softer. And there's some work being done in China, again, about the co-location with something like oysters and the seaweed. So, yes, the seaweed grows, it takes in CO2, but releases out oxygen. And at a very local level, potentially, you've got, you're starting to mitigate very, very slightly against those pH changes. And then that helps potentially helps the shellfish. So there's, again, been work done in America, where they've been planting seagrass beds. Again, another plant that's taking in CO2 to help their local oyster industries get over any effects that they're starting to have with ocean acidification and the shellfish shells getting softer and impacting on their growth.
It's almost making it sound like what a gardener would call buddy plant.
It's exactly that, and this is the whole thing as well. Seaweed cultivation is agriculture. It's you're growing something. You need to be aware of the environment, how that impacts on what you're trying to grow, and then the potential impacts you're having as well, and how you minimize those.
Absolutely, yeah. I've had a podcast recently with a fisheries scientist in Iceland, and one of the points he was making is that when they're looking to try to assess the fish stocks, some of the more they maybe go to sea and count species and try to assess the stocks that way. But he's of the mind, he says, that's just looking at a computer. As it's as good as the person that put the information in. He says they need to. He says they need to look at nature.
Yeah, it's having that respect for nature.
Yeah, it's just so important. I would have thought that probably there is no difference when you're talking about the aquaculture, and it's no different from agriculture.
No, I mean, and it's quite amusing because we do at times have people mistake what we're doing the same as salmon farming, and it's completely different. We don't put any inputs in, so it's the seaweed grows with whatever nutrients are available to it naturally, and there's an education thing. So we have you take people out to the seaweed farm and show them how different it looks, say, from a salmon farm. And we have a lower visual impact, and it just looks completely different. And that's the whole thing. It's again, because it's a new industry, and new industries can be terrifying because you don't know what it is. It's that education element again, and showing people what it looks like, what we're doing. And actually, it's like it's just showing people and starting to take, again, conversation and starting to take some of the fear out of it.
I think you're maybe being a wee bit too nice. I think maybe rather than showing, it's educating.
It is, but actually you don't know if you get a conversation going. You don't know that someone. Yeah, sometimes you get some people will have really interesting insight. There's things we're too maybe close to it. And they'll have a really interesting insight about, well, have you thought of? So yeah, there's education on both sides.
I think that's showing a healthy mind because you stay open for other people's ideas and thoughts.
Yeah, and I think you have to. I say because you don't know. It could be that they come up with a better idea of how to do something. That saves us time and a bit of effort, and it could be something really small. It can be, have you thought of using a different way of attaching on the lines? We have changed how we put. So we seed line in what we call a nursery, and we've changed. We were using pipes, just plastic pipes, down pipes, drainage, drain pipes. And we've gone for a different diameter, now a smaller diameter, and that's easier for people to deploy. And that was with a conversation with someone who was deploying our seaweed. Have you thought of? And then doing that and going, oh, that works. So we're still learning.
But it's relatively new, I would have thought, although seaweed's been around a long time.
I mean, we've been growing since 2004, and that was one of my colleagues who's now retired. That was Maeve Kelly started, and that actually, the seaweed growing at SAM started because Maeve's project was looking at reducing the impacts of salmon farming. So using the nutrients that salmon poop out and using that to feed the seaweed. And that's where that research started, and then it's developed since then.
Okay, so is there a noticeable? Is it noticeable that there's seaweeds growing in areas where salmon are farmed?
So the industry's played with it, and you do get a positive effect. But again, there's a site selection thing. Sometimes the salmon farm's not in the most appropriate area, where seaweed wants to grow. So, it's whether you can co-locate the two together. And it's a difficult one because you end up, the licensing's complicated. And, how you get your license and, do I want to introduce seaweed? I'm going to have to get another license. So the licensing in a way needs streamlining. So the licensing can be a bit complicated as well. And then for someone who's growing salmon, where am I going to put the seaweed? What's the market for that? And that's the issue at the moment, that because it's a new industry, the markets aren't as well developed. So you're not always clear about where the seaweed's going to go and who's going to buy your seaweed.
I just hope when you're talking about licensing that the people that are issuing the licenses know a little or a lot about seaweed, and it's
changing. It's an interesting one, and Marine Scotland will say they recognise it, but it's a difficult. Actually, COVID hasn't helped as well. It's a difficult one, and I think it's matching up the policy to the licensing. And there's times a slight gap between what the policy says and what how the licensing's been done, and the licensing, because again it's a new industry, the licensing changes and it's keeping up with that. So we have a license. So our farm, our two farms have licenses. We've got a very small farm at Kerrera on the larger farm at Port of Ullin. And they both have licenses. So we adhere the way same as anybody else who's farming commercially to our license. And it's just it's an education thing. That's new industry and how the licensing, and they're looking at this, how the licensing can be improved to help the industry, the industry along as well.
It must be really quite exciting.
It is. I keep on. I started SAMS late 2006, and it's been non-stop since I started. And I keep on actually sort of hoping for a bit of a break.
But
it'd be nice for.
But you don't really want.
It would be nice to be able to contemplate your navel sometimes and have just a bit of thinking space. It's been very busy.
Yeah. No, I think it's usually exciting. Michele, I wonder if would you have any objections if I come down to visit the site?
No, if you let us know. There's not much in the water at the moment because we've harvested. So really next sort of late April, early May next year is probably the best time because then you'll see some seaweed.
I've got a lot of we have a great love for that area. If I was to say, my wife and I, we honeymooned in Oban 51 years ago. And I've got a lot of good friends, fishermen down there. So it's an area we love visiting, and I would really love to come and see what you're doing.
No, if you let us know, I wouldn't advise at the moment because there's nothing in the water really.
Yeah.
But round about sort of April, May next year.
So
we'll have material in the water.
So do you mind if maybe before then I call you and we could come down through April?
Just let us know. That. Weather dependent, we can plan it out depending on the weather.
But of course, I'm from the fishing industry. We know all about weather dependency.
Oh yes, weather dependent. Yeah, so that's the other thing. We are weather dependent.
The whole fishing is. The whole industry is fishing. Anything to do with the sea.
It's all weather dependent. So let us know and we can arrange something.
It's Mother Nature, and I often say I just hope we never ever find out how she works because we'll screw it up. not we as you and I, but as people.
Oh, yeah. But no, so get in touch with us, and I'm sure we can arrange something.
Michele, we've been talking over an hour here, and many a person would say, "Well, how on earth could you talk for an hour about seaweed?" But I've just found it so fascinating, and I can actually see your passion coming through, and I can hear it. I think it's wonderful what you're doing. I think it's brilliant, and you must feel so lucky to be doing such a positive thing with nature dependency as well.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's great, and it's interesting to be at something that's just starting. And there's still so much we don't know. And from my point of view, establishing a new industry, I want to see that it does get established, but I want to see that it gets established in the right way, and that we bring everybody along with it. It's not a case of because it's very community. County has a very community based. And so you just have to look at Southwest Mull, and it's just if we can bring everybody along with it, that's great as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you were saying there about the pig farming when you say the cost. Yes, and everything does come down to a cost at the end of the day. But just imagine the cost of taking all the sand deals, fishing out the sand deals where our fish haven't got their natural food. Well, what cost is that?
But again, it's an education thing, and there's not always that. Yeah, it's a difficult one because people's livings depend on that. There's not maybe the sort of thinking ahead, which is not necessarily that community's fault, because if you're not providing them with an alternative, and that's their livelihood. And again, you can argue it out that if you keep on doing it, you won't have a livelihood in 10, 20 years or whatever time. But it's difficult for people to what's my alternative? What you're giving me as an alternative? I've done it for years, and it again comes down to conversations and education on both sides, and providing people with an alternative. I mean, of course, it's like everything in life. You'll get some people who don't want to change what they do, and you can, you just have to have that conversation with them again, and see whether you can compromise and meet somewhere in the middle. But it's a difficult one. I say, it's people's livelihoods, and it's whether you are providing them with an alternative.
Yeah, but the way you say that is right. You have a conversation and it's working with people, but really what we're talking about here is that conversation is with nature.
Yeah, the conversation is with nature. And I think, again, that sometimes people don't recognise that. If something's always been there, people expect it to always be there, and then it's a bit of a shock when it disappears.
Yeah. But places that are dependent are aware of that. The Faroese, I've used in my fishing days. I've done a lot of business in the Faroes, and they jokingly describe as a land of maybe, because maybe it'll be stormy and the boat won't sail. Maybe it'll be okay and it will sail.
Yeah, I visited the Faroes. It's a nice place.
Oh, I think it's.
So yeah, it's a nice place.
Lovely people.
It's just having that conversation, and what's the alternative? Is there an alternative? Have you thought of? Yeah, it's having the conversation.
If you don't mind me saying it, Michele, I can just picture you, welly boots, sitting on a rock on the beach, talking, asking Mother Nature. It's lovely. Well, I think we'll wrap it up, and can't but thank you so much. I've really, really been fascinated with the conversation, and I think it's admirable what you're doing, and what a fantastic job.
No, thank you. I mean, yes, I do have a great deal of job satisfaction.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see it, and I love your respect.
I mean, you do have to have that respect because, you want to work with nature, not against it.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, it's not a word we hear as much of these days as we would maybe like, but it's important.
Yes, it is important.
Yeah. Michele, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
What I would like to do, if you didn't mind, my friend in Orkney, Sam, who's done vinegars, I would love a conversation with him and yourself in the future, because he's got other things to add to that as well, and I'm sure you would find it fascinating. Even maybe the guy your friend in Harris who's doing the...
Oh yes, Lewis and so that would be interesting to have a conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All the best.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you for listening to Seafood Matters podcast. You can subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. You can join me on Instagram and Facebook by searching for @Seafood Matters Podcast. If you have any questions or episode suggestions, please email me at jim@seafoodmatterspodcast.com or get in touch through my website, seafoodmatterspodcast.com.